Welcome to tonight's session featuring presentations from representatives of 3 neighboring state leagues on their respective tax policy positions. Elaine, please go to the next slide. Should be
I'm sorry.
That's okay. There you go. Thank you. The Committee to Review LWVNC State and Local Tax Policy Position is sponsoring tonight's session. Its members include me, acting as co-chair with Ruth Ann Groh, a member of the Orange-Durham-Chatham Local League, Lucille Howard, who was a key contributor to the last study done in the late 80s, and a member of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg League, and Elaine Okel, a member of the Wake County League and tonight's Zoom facilitator. I will now turn it over to Elaine for her to review the Zoom meeting basics with attendees.
Oops. Good evening. My name's Elaine Okel from the Wake League. This evening, you will find your Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. We would like you to put your questions in the chat box this evening and or raise your hand under the reactions area when we're doing questions and answers. Please do not unmute yourself or chat to others in the chat box. Thank you.
If you could return to the prior slide, Elaine, please.
I don't know if I can. Let me see. This one?
Thank you. Yes, that one. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you for the instructions. Tonight's session is the 4th in a series of 5 informative sessions focusing on specific aspects of state and local taxation, including learning about the criteria for a fair and equitable system and assessing the question of whether North Carolina's current tax policy of lowering corporate taxes furthers the goals and economic growth of the state for its residents. Our ultimate goal is to work to member agreement on a revised LWVNC state and local tax policy and will be the subject of our 5th and final session to be held on June 6th. With that background, let me outline tonight's format and objectives. Now we have the next slide, Elaine. Each of our guest speakers will make a presentation on their respective state tax policy position, including its history and background, how it was used in their advocacy efforts, and how the position was consistent with or furthered other state league public policy positions. They will also highlight any specific terms or phrases used in their public policy statement that were particularly effective or helpful in their advocacy efforts. Before opening the session to Q&A from our audience members, the guest speakers as a group, after they've completed their individual presentations, will be given a chance to discuss and comment what they've heard from each other. Again, the objective of tonight's session is to provide an opportunity for LWVNC members to gain an understanding of the principles and concepts used in the 3 neighboring state leagues to constructively advocate for or against proposed legislation. And particularly keep in mind whether there's how or whether we can use those same principles and concepts that could be included in LWVNC's updated tax policy position statement. Next slide, please, Elaine. We have 3 distinguished league colleagues with us tonight representing the state leagues of South Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. First to present will be Dr. Holley Ulbrich. Holley is returning to us as a guest speaker from our 3rd session. She is past president and a life member of the League of Women Voters of South Carolina and an alumni distinguished professor emerita of economics with Clemson University, specializing in state and public finance. Our second guest speaker is Denise Harrington. Denise is a member and current state director of advocacy for the League of Women Voters of Virginia. She is a retired teacher and lifelong advocate for children in public education, serving the Virginia Education Association in several capacities. She has 2 master's degrees and is currently completing her doctorate with a specialization in teacher leadership. Our last guest speaker is Ethel Detch. Ethel is a member and current secretary of the League of Women Voters of Nashville. In 2021, Ethel served on a statewide committee to revise the League of Women Voters of Tennessee's policy statements. She is a retired state government policy analyst with 28 years working for Tennessee's Comptroller of the Treasury. She has a master's degree in public administration from the University of Tennessee. I will now turn it over to Holley to begin her presentation, and that will be followed by Denise and then by Ethel. Holley?
Thank you. I enjoyed reading your position and comparing it to ours. I've been the South Carolina League's point person on tax and budgetary issues since the mid-70s. And sometimes I testify as a Clemson economist, and sometimes I testify as a league representative, and I try to keep the two straight. But generally, there's not much of a conflict. I think you have an excellent statement of general principles. Ours is much shorter, probably too short. But the positions that you take need to be both defensive and proactive. And we have a lot of defensive positions because we're usually playing defense on tax and public finance issues. And I think we have some things that are missing in ours that are present in yours, some that are present in ours and missing in yours. For one thing, we focus much more on the property tax, which is heavily controlled by the state of South Carolina. There isn't any reference to property tax there, but it's an integral part of a state and local revenue system because they're really inseparable. Municipalities and counties and school boards are all creations of the state. And therefore, whatever they're allowed to do, whatever they're forbidden to do in terms of finance, the state has a pretty strong say in it. One of the issues that arose particularly in the late 1980s was the issue of equalization, because you've got equity in your principles, we've got equity in our principles, but one of the ways in which the tax system creates inequities is by forcing local governments to rely on their own resources when their ability to raise revenue is very different. And I noticed that the span of property tax mill rates is double from the lowest to the highest in your many counties. I lost count of them after trying to count them down. And so that's something that some kind of equalization that the state can provide. We have a thing called the local government fund that's a revenue sharing with counties and cities. And there's a question of education funding, which a lot of our effort has been in tax policy has been tied up with education, because the state is a major provider of education funding, the formula, the way they distribute it, but also the property tax plays an important role. So it's hard for us to separate education policy and education funding from tax policy. We've put this position together by sort of collecting pieces, so it's kind of a patchwork. We found in 1995, we found that we had positions on tax and revenue policies under local government. We had them under education. We had them under various state government entities. So we pulled them together and created a tax position that we've used fairly successfully, particularly in addressing the legislature about education funding, about property tax issues, and trying to encourage them to do what North Carolina has done and many other states, which is expand the coverage of services, which not only generates more revenue, but also, sales tax coverage of services, which not only generates additional revenue, but also because services are more heavily consumed by higher income families. Lots of poor people wash their own dogs, clean their own houses, do their own laundry, all kinds of things. So the coverage of services makes the sales tax much less regressive and therefore much fairer to people on the bottom of the scale. As I said, we have 8 positions and 4 of them deal with property tax. Use of tax incentives, which you do mention. We have somewhat more detailed discussion because, again, that's a joint function of the county government and sometimes the municipal government, mainly the county government and the state government. And in particular, things like if you're going to give incentives and then they don't provide the jobs and the investment that they promised, you need to pay back the tax relief that you received, things like that. So we have a lot of interesting things to say about property tax assessment, use value versus market value of agricultural property and forestry, which get a tremendous tax break in South Carolina, and often it's given to a developer who's just waiting to sell the land for some higher purpose or lower purpose, as the case might be. So in terms of being proactive, I wish we had had the good sense to put an income tax position into our policy statements, because we have had some reduction in the state income tax. Nothing as dramatic as North Carolina, but reading what's going on in North Carolina made me very aware of the fact that we probably need to make a statement about the role of the income tax, mildly progressive as it is, important fundraiser that it is, having some different positive attributes that keeps our revenue system diverse. So I'm going to be taking back from this some things to suggest to the state of the South Carolina League to improve their positions. One of the areas that neither of us addresses that I think is really important is the use of fees and charges as a revenue source. The advantage of fees and charges is that if it's only a subgroup of people, it's not really a common good or a shared good, then maybe the people who benefit from it should bear a larger share of the cost through park fees, recreation fees, college tuition, all of that sort of thing. There's a role for general funding because it's good to have it available, but there's also a role for people to contribute to the cost because they benefit from it. Unfortunately, fees and charges are mostly regressive, so it makes it less equitable. So you have to balance all of these considerations. But there is as I pointed out in my previous session, there's a lot of advantage to diversity. Please tell me when my time is up. I'm sort of running on here. just when it's time for me to quit. So I think that having broad principles gives you a certain amount of latitude in addressing a particular issue, but it's also helpful to have some specific positions so that your league will have a hand in shaping those positions and take ownership of them. And I'm sure that you wish that you had had a position on income tax. It probably would not have done a great deal of good as far as the legislature is concerned, but it might have been enabled you to raise more public outcry and concern about protecting the income tax.
Holley, I'm sorry, I will have to.
Okay, that's a good place to stop. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Denise, please.
Hi, how are you all? Elaine, would you please show the first slide?
Yes, just a minute. I'm trying to get there.
I understand. So while she's doing that, let me just tell you a little bit about Virginia, and just in case you don't know, you know, what happened basically in Virginia was that a miracle happened. No, not so much a miracle, but last year we had divided government, the last term, 2 years. Mm-hmm. This year, because of what happened last year, we had the Senate that was Democratic and we had the House that was Republican. And so any, quote, bills that were not favorable, let's say that way, to one chamber, the other chamber canceled it out, and vice versa for both. And so at that point, very little got done. So this is when I came up with Your Voice, Your Vote, Your Power 2.0. That means people have to get out and vote for people who promote the causes that are concerning to them. And the biggest thing is always taxing and taxes for public education. So that's where my focus will be. Next slide. So in the League of Women Voters, we had more than these priorities you're seeing, but I want you to focus on what's in red. And then public education. The state should pay its fair share. And JLARC is a Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee, and it tends to be nonpartisan and yet bipartisan. And what happens is whenever JLARC comes out with something, it is so accurate. And it went hand in hand with the League of Women Voters conducting a 2-year study on education equity. Next slide, please. And so, but here's the roadblock. And I say this because I know I'm dealing with folks from the South, and I feel very comfortable in saying this. We almost need a Southern strategy for public education and financing, right? Mm-hmm. And the wonderful Dillon Rule. And I think the title of this slide, I have the history of Virginia's taxation Bird Organization Democrats, okay, or Dixiecrats. And basically the Dillon rule just said, no, whatever you want to do in your local government, forget it. You have to come to the state. It is considered antiquated at this point. Next slide.
Oops, sorry.
Now, so this is what happened. In the General Assembly, we have a majority of Democrats in both chambers, but we have a Republican governor in the executive office. So as you can imagine, people said, we need to do something. And so here was the League of Women Voters. We conducted our education equity. A lot of you have met Mary Jennings and Beth Obenshane. And then this is what we did. First of all, we formed coalitions. We had this great data. And the first coalition is the Coalition of Rural Counties and Schools. And those were superintendents. They invited legislators from both sides of the aisle, because most of them in our rural areas are Republican. And they showed them, they said, listen, we need some help. They showed roofs that were falling apart. They showed schools with mold growing everywhere because the HVAC systems were so old. And then and they joined this in the largest coalition for children, parents, and public education called Fund Our Schools Coalition. I just named a few people, the teachers union, but what was interesting is that J. Lark's study report said the same thing that we exactly found out in our equity study. So the biggest idea was raise revenue, allow localities to levy at least a 1% tax by a referendum. And you think, well, let the people in the localities decide. Change Virginia's constitution from this nasty business of our constitution. It says, oh, the General Assembly will seek to ensure, as opposed to ensure. The support, the SOQs are called standards of quality. It's the very, very basics. And then again, change our funding formula. And I'm excited that someone from Tennessee is here because next slide, please. We are in Virginia looking at changing our local composite index funding formula. And we understand that Tennessee has already done this. Okay. And so now I want to talk to you a little bit about, if you could change the slide.
I'm trying to, I apologize.
It's all right. And so we're going to get down to, actually, I think the next slide is about the particular bills.
Sorry, I have to.
That's okay.
Just wait, I apologize. Go ahead, talk.
All right, I will try to talk. My computer just, so what happened is, I don't know if you all are aware, but with Brown versus the Board of Education, there were 5 cases that came in front of the Supreme Court. And one of them happens to be right from Virginia in Prince Edward County or Farmville area. And so what basically happened was all the other, we had 8 localities that put in a tax. We had all these bills that said, please give us the right, begging, again, the state to give them the right, the localities the right to do, to at least have, why isn't this coming up? It's not even coming up on my own computer. To at least give them the right to have, to levy a tax. And then there was another tax policy that in the Fund Our Schools Coalition, some of the organizations were exploring. Well, first of all, we did not want another regressive tax. That's already been mentioned. But one of the things I want to say to you is that in doing so, we actually put ourselves in a predicament a little bit. And then we started to talk and said, let the localities decide. And so what I want to get to are the bills. The localities tried to get the right to have a referendum for a 1% tax. And that's truly what happened. HB 60 came from Prince Edward County. All the other localities sort of went back. Now, Prince Edward is extremely conservative, and Republican. And many of the bills I have counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 localities. And out of the 8, 4 of them were from Republican areas. And so this was a bipartisan effort. It passed, give them the right. There are only 6 counties. Then there was an omnibus bill that linked all of this together with the recommendations from JLARC, class size ratios, et cetera, funding. And so this is what happened.
I'm sorry, Denise, I can't find another slide on that deck. That was the last slide I had for you.
It should be a slide that has all these bills up. That's fine. I'm talking from it right now, so they can have it at the end. That's fine.
Okay, all right, sorry.
No, that's okay.
You're about out of time.
Okay, so good. To wrap things up, we formed these coalitions and we made certain recommendations. We lobbied, we did everything, but of course our governor vetoed. So our governor right now, we're in a budget battle. And so basically 168 million that was supposed to be a digital tax to raise money for schools, he decided to take it for some type of other initiatives. And so that's where we are. Lawyers are getting an injunction against him through the Inspector General to try to stop this. But we still know things are. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we did. Form coalitions. Thank you. Bipartisan coalitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And I apologize for some of our technical difficulties, but got through it fine. So I really appreciate your patience. The next presenter is Ethel, and I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Martha. The Tennessee League's position on financing state and local government is fairly long. So on my slide, I've included the main position statement, as well as 7 criteria that the Tennessee League considers relevant when reviewing various kinds of taxes. And I've also put the link on this slide in case somebody wants to go read the whole thing and read our other positions as well. Our state league reviewed and adopted all of our positions, revised many of them in 2021. We did them all in one fell swoop. Several of them hadn't been reviewed for several years and were out of date. It was also COVID and we needed something to do, I guess. I don't know. I think we were also concerned about our governor and our legislature who were expressing intentions to make some really significant changes to our public education system. And we wanted to think through what our positions needed to be about that. Tennessee's state and local governments fund services through a variety of taxes and fees. But we are overall considered a low tax state. The Tax Foundation ranks our state 3rd from the bottom in overall tax burden.
Mm-hmm.
At the state level, the sales tax is the primary revenue source. A portion of that is shared with local governments. The state collects it all, but shares, gives a portion back to the locals. Our state sales tax is 7%, and the local governments can then impose their own sales tax up to 2.75%, which most of them have done, I believe. Consequently, most Tennesseans pay nearly 10% in sales tax. Although food is taxed at 4%, and that is a slight improvement because I can remember when it was everything was taxed at the 9.75%. All of our property taxes are local. We don't have a state property tax. Oh, and back on groceries, I was just going to say I think we're one of only 13 states that taxes groceries at all. In 2014, Tennessee passed a constitutional amendment that prohibits any form of personal income tax. This makes it unlikely that form of revenue will ever be permitted, at least in the near future. During my tenure in Tennessee, we've had two major efforts to try to impose a state income tax, both of which failed. So we just have some kind of an aversion to income tax in this state that doesn't even, it defies logic. The people it would help are the ones most against it. But our position, though, as a league still states that we support a broad-based personal income tax. But as I said, we have little optimism about that. We are one of only 9 states that does not have a broad-based income tax. Could you switch to slide 2?
Whoops.
Or the next slide. It's the next slide. I wanted to just give you, these are just pies. You don't have to be able to see the small numbers, but I wanted to just give you a sense of how heavily dependent we are on sales tax. This is 23-24's budget. In some years, it's about 60%. This one's 56%. So we are a pretty regressive revenue system in this state. We disproportionately tax our lowest income residents. In addition, this heavy dependence on sales tax causes our state government to have massive fluctuations in revenue every time there's a major recession, because the first thing people do when economic times get hard is to stop buying things and cut their spending, particularly big ticket items. And as a result of that characteristic, our state government has to maintain a rather large reserve, which is called the rainy day fund, because that's really what it is. It's there for those times when our heavily sales tax dependent system starts to decline and fails us for some period of time. Our franchise and excise tax is our state's second highest source of revenue. It produces about 20% of the total. All corporations, limited partnerships, LLCs, and business trusts that are chartered or registered in Tennessee must pay franchise and excise taxes. The excise tax is based on net earnings or income at a rate of 6.5%. The franchise tax at 0.25% has historically been based on the greater of net worth or the book value of real and tangible personal property owned or used in Tennessee. However, on the last day of our session, a few weeks ago, our General Assembly repealed that personal property option for the calculation, which is going to result in a large rebate to the businesses that use that method. It's estimated that it's going to cost our state $400 million beginning this year.
Oh, geez.
In addition to the franchise excise tax, businesses that gross $100,000 or more must also pay an additional state business tax as well as a city business tax. I guess in conclusion, we have a low tax rate, regressive tax structure. It does tend to result in lower revenues and less funding available. Also have a pie chart here about where your our state tax dollar goes, and it shows you, that education is our largest chunk, and I believe the health services. I can't see it; it's kind of cut off the bottom, but I think that's the next bigger one. But because of the way our tax system is structured, we have less flexibility. We have less funding available. It has, I guess, its pros and cons. Anyway, I'll be happy to answer any questions or talk about it more.
Thank you, Ethel. We'd now like to give our group of presenters some time to just maybe discuss among themselves what you just heard about each other's state tax policies as well as the state tax structure. To maybe sort of help kick off that discussion, I was actually going to ask you a question that I think all three of you addressed very well, which was how your state league has used your tax policy position with other league public policy positions. And I think what really comes out over and over again, obviously, is public education. Is sort of the obvious one. And the reason why I say that is it's one of our committee's goals here when we look to revise the North Carolina state and local tax policy position, is that we want to have members understand that our state and local tax policy position can further our other program, public policy goals. And so it was good. I appreciate you guys being sharing all of that with us. So maybe what I might kick it off with instead is our residents kind of perceive a tension, I'll call it, between balancing revenue needs to fund our essential state services with also trying to achieve equity and sharing the tax burden that we have to raise that revenue to fund those essential services. Do you have any thoughts in terms of how your state tax policy position may address that, or maybe something you would like to include? Holley?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. One is the equity in education funding. And I have to say, as an economist, people are not always enthusiastic about talking about taxes. But if you make education the vehicle for a conversation about taxes, you're probably going to generate a lot more interest. But yeah, there's several points in our positions where we focus on equity. One is we'd like to expand coverage of sales tax, which North Carolina has done, to include more services, because those are consumed by higher income households, and that makes it more equitable. We're also concerned, although we haven't been as vocal because we've had so many other horrendous issues to address in this last legislative session, but that they're gradually reducing the state income tax. At one time, the top bracket rate was 7%, and it's now down to, I think, 6%, and scheduled to go down another half. Is based on revenues, and I think that's kind of a mistake. I think the income tax and sales tax are really the two foundations of state revenue, and then you bring in the property tax because you can't run away from the property tax. You can't take your real estate out of the jurisdiction very easily. So it's one that you can make people pay and they can't do much about it. That doesn't mean it's not a competitive issue and it should be ignored, but that's one of the reasons why we focus so heavily on issues related to property tax. Yeah. But we also spend a lot of time on education funding. That's a really big issue.
And Ethel, you mentioned that you don't have the income tax, and even though it would benefit the people who seem to be most against it are the ones that may benefit the most from it. Did you want to say anything more about that?
I guess my earliest.
I'm sorry. I think part of that is some people just don't want to pay taxes. They just see it as sort of some sort of boogeyman.
They don't, and yeah. I think they don't understand how they're being overtaxed with a sales tax. They don't realize that they're actually paying more of their income to taxes probably than if they paid a personal income tax. And I guess in the early 1990s, we did pass a major education initiative in this state, and the proposal was to fund it with an income tax. That's why they were trying to use education as a vehicle and pass an income tax. And we had people driving around the Capitol honking their horns for weeks. It was awful having to work there. But we did, though, pass this education initiative that really worked on the equity issue. The state was sued by our rural superintendents and the rural school districts because they could not benefit from the state funding as much as some of the others. They couldn't raise their own local funding on top of what they got from the state. And so we did come up with a pretty complicated funding formula that I think worked pretty well for a long time. It still has, I guess our current governor is he's a big proponent of vouchers, and he wanted a funding system that he could cut off students. And so we now have a different funding system, which I'm retired and I've not studied as much, but it is, I think it still has some components of the former one in terms of what local districts have to contribute. But it is set up now so that it's a per student amount, and if they pass the voucher legislation, that then, those students and the money with them can just leave. But it failed this year. Each house had their own version of the bill, and the House and the Senate could not agree. So it did fail this year, but it may be back. I don't know.
Yeah, I can respond to something Ethel said that I think is really, really important. The difference between the income tax and sales tax is visibility. You don't see the sales tax because you pay it in little dribbles, but you have to fill out an income tax form every year.
Yes.
And it's the same reason that now that most homeowners who have mortgages, the property tax is sort of buried in their mortgage and they don't notice it, and there's less resistance. So anything you can do to make the income tax less visible and the sales tax more visible might change that. Connecticut did that, and way back in 1976. It's the same situation as Tennessee, and it's a little state, so it was really easy to go out of state to go shopping. And they finally passed an income tax, cut the sales tax, and lived happily ever after, as far as my relatives can tell me.
But I'd like to chime in a little bit. I appreciate this discussion. I still say we need a Southern strategy for fully supporting children and parents in public education. But I want to tell you a little bit about Virginia. I did not tell you that we rank within the top 10 for wealthy states, but we are considered a low tax state. And so what was happening within the Fund Our Schools Coalition was that some people had worked on something in Massachusetts that they had done. And of course, and once we heard the M word, Massachusetts, we called it Taxachusetts.
Yeah.
And then we said, how in the world is that ever going to work here? They said, well, they called it a up tax. And I said, what is that? And of course, that's when it is a progressive tax. And if you're in the gazillion dollars, you pay more. And if you're not, you pay less. And I said, oh, that'll never fly in Virginia. So, well, guess what? It passed both chambers. And there were some people from the other side who voted for it. And I thought, oh my goodness. But guess what? Our governor vetoed it. And then at one point, he wanted Virginia to not have an income tax. And then I understood that some of the top people on one of our members is chairing the House Finance Committee. That's Vivian Watts. And she said they had to come to Jesus conference with him. So expression from the South, no offense to anyone's religion. And they said, if you don't do that. So they finally did something about what's called the food tax technically, but localities already had done some type of a sales tax. And now what was being proposed was 6 localities got the right to do a 1% sales tax. But one of the things we discovered, a 1% in rural Southwest Virginia, closer to Tennessee than Richmond, means nothing almost compared to a 1% in Northern Virginia. You all know where I'm going. They're the rich folks. Nova, what we call it, Northern Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia, any place close to the capital. It's not just higher to live, but they pay gazillion. But they were willing to do a sales tax, a kind of, but they called it an entertainment tax. And so, because they didn't want it just sales tax and everybody just pays and it's a regressive tax. They wanted a more of an entertainment kind of tax. If you're going to the opera, if you're going to, kind of thing. But people wanted that. People said anything to, even if you have in Williamsburg, we used to have a little Grand Ole Opry here. But people said they wanted this, and it was bipartisan. And I understand that certain rural legislators went to the governor and said, what are you doing? Our schools are falling apart out here. Give us, and of course he vetoed. And then the up tax I never thought Virginia would even go for something like tax the millionaires. I thought, oh gosh, we're going to hear people calling people socialists. But on the contrary, they said Virginia is so behind And yet we have all this wealth. And so that's kind of where we are. We're in a dichotomous situation. And then, of course, we have a Ron DeSantis style person. And he's tried to take the history away. We know about Hillsdale College. We know about Tennessee and Michigan in particular. And so he's tried to do that. He's tried to do a lot. And so it was a backlash to him. So he vetoed things. And so now our advocacy strategy, right now, a letter was sent to him, a statement from the Fund Our Schools Coalition, which the League is a member, to tell him certain things about the budget. But the digital tax of $168 million is not going to go to some type of private type schools that he wanted. And it's going to be a big show now. But I just wanted to let you know where we are.
Yeah.
People wanted that. I know it's a regressive tax, that 1% option, but they still wanted it.
Thank you. This discussion's been really good. Let's take a break for a minute from this discussion, see if we have any questions from our audience. If you do have a question, you can either type it into the chat room or raise your hand using the reaction button. You have anything? Not seeing any raised. Oh, Mary Cleanse.
Mary Colick.
No, we have Mary
Cleanse
Cleanse.
too, Mary, yeah.
Go ahead, Mary Cleanse.
Mary Cleanse and Mary Colick.
Yeah. Yes, they're both.
We've been hanging around this issue for a long time.
Yes.
Mary Cleanse.
Listening to
Yeah, go ahead, Mary. Sorry.
listening to the conversation is just fascinating, and it really brings out the idea of how can we educate the public on public funding, and the way to fund public needs are through taxes. And then how can we have a fair tax system? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it would benefit all of us, all of our states that we're talking here. The Southern, I love the idea of the Southern strategy.
Yeah.
Is that what you called, Denise? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because
Yes.
there's so much commonality about this. And how are we going to fund the needed services? To me is the big question. And then how can we make that as equitable and fair as possible? And that probably is a big marketing campaign, but also the language has to be friendly to the people down the street who hate taxes or don't even know what taxes are about. It's so wonky. But that's why we love it, and that's why we're here tonight.
I like
Otherwise-
what you said.
Yes.
Is messaging. That's what we need. In the South, we need a Southern strategy that has the best message. We use a few things like fund our kids, fund our future. And then we started talking to some real estate folks and said, guess what? Property values go down. That's going to affect you, and it's going to affect the area. But if the schools go down, the property values will go down because people won't move to your locality because they'll think the schools are trash. And then people are like, wait a minute, your house is your biggest asset. Do you really want it to depreciate in value? And this is kind of, we started having some of these conversations and people were rethinking that thing.
Yeah.
So I think you're on to something, all of you, about property taxes. I've seen that as a big battle when I taught in a suburban area in the York County School Division in Virginia. But it was a lot of military there, and you got federal impact aid. But I think we need that Southern strategy. I'll be quiet.
We do, and we actually made I did something extremely stupid. In fact, we had a debate over whether this Act 388 was, or the Act of Secession was, the worst bill ever passed by the South Carolina legislature, and it was kind of a toss-up. But what it did was eliminate taxes for schools operation on homeowners only. and raised the sales tax by 1% and guaranteeing that if that wasn't enough to make up the lost revenue, they would make it up. But it cut the tie between the value of your property and the quality of your school. And so that then people resented the property taxes, because if they paid higher property taxes, they weren't going to get any more better education. So it didn't make any difference. So I think that people need to be aware of that link. I know my daughter lives in the next town over, because she said that to buy the same house in Clemson in a particular elementary school district would be $20,000 more than it was in the next town. And she was able to get a kid in Clemson Elementary anyway, so it didn't matter. But the point is, it affects property values. And that's something that people will listen to, that they will care about.
Yep.
And the quality of public services, not just education, is a very important factor. There's a really a good opportunity in all of our states, all of which share not only the need for an education strategy, but rural areas that are low income, low poverty, and low housing prices. And now that you can work from anywhere, you don't have to go to your job, there's an attraction to being able to buy relatively inexpensive property and work from home and pay income tax in some cases, property taxes, sales taxes, to support the local economy. And they don't have to create jobs in the low country, in the poor interior parts of the low country, in order to be attractive in other ways. So we need to rethink our economic development strategy and the role Texas plays in that.
I absolutely agree. Living currently in one of the poorest and most rural county in North Carolina, I want to give Mary Kolick a chance. She's had her hand raised for a while. Mary.
Yeah, I don't think it's earth shattering, but so I'm from Connecticut, so I can speak to the Connecticut experience with the tax.
Oh,
But you know what, the whole idea of a Southern strategy, what I've found over the past 10 years, having been very active and having to develop and defend education budgets and taxes in my previous life, here, you don't know what you don't experience. And if people haven't experienced the benefit of taxes, it's all theoretical and negative, because we also don't teach about tax. There's the context of what people understand through their education about taxes. There's the context of gerrymandering here, and the kind of the context of what's happened in terms of the general trust of institutions. That's context. But the real thing is, people that I've spoken to don't understand the difference between the extent, perhaps, I don't even want to say quality, we have some really quality things here, but the extent of services that you get when your taxes are higher. If you haven't experienced that, there would be no way in God's green earth that people that have experienced the services that they get through the public schools in Connecticut, and I work for the poorest district and the most affluent, would ever put up with what they don't get here. And so as more people move in, but people don't know, people are, have no sense of what they're not getting, and how cost effective it would be to share that cost through tax-based support. So number one, but number two, the other thing is, as we get more people moving in from different places that have experienced that, harnessing their voices in terms of building a position within their communities of trust and connection is critical over time, because then, it's not just what I had and you don't have. It's about being able to speak to what the benefits of that is, what we saw in terms of our special education services that are not provided for on a general basis here, that benefited students, and that benefited us all in the long run, or whatever it's going to be, public services, garbage collection, the maintenance of your roads. So that's where I struggle, is because we say, well, gee, people work against their own best interests, but they only know what they know. And if you have never seen it or had it or experienced it, what are you going to, you're not going to go out and pay more not knowing what it's going to get you. So how can we use that influx of people that can explain that well? How can we get them connected to the communities? That's kind of I keep ruminating on that, because this whole tax thing is, North Carolina is going to zero tax. We're going down to no business tax, probably no state income tax, and the increase of voucher outlay is just going to break public schools. This is a watershed here. So policy, you know, people have to understand what's at stake for them to go with more taxes, or they're never gonna do it.
Do Virginia and South Carolina have vouchers?
We have limited vouchers. There's been a push for it, but there's also a lot of resistance, and there's also a constitutional provision that keeps getting tested, and they keep changing Supreme Court judges, hoping that they finally get one to give it to them. So we have very limited vouchers at present. And the vouchers don't help poor families. They live in rural counties that don't have any private schools, you know, and they
It
can't
hurts them.
afford the amount. Yeah, so it's clearly aimed at a different clientele than the ones they propose it to be for. And
So
on the other hand, they did also, they're very concerned about the public schools because we have so many vacancies, teacher vacancies. So they actually are now paying decent salaries to public school teachers for the first time in a long time. And
So
one of the things we don't realize is we're riding a post-COVID high in revenue. There's a couple of things that contributed. One is just post-COVID, and the other is allowing states to collect sales tax on internet sales, which gave a big boost to sales tax revenue. The good times are not going to roll forever, and when they end or take a dip, it's going to be the devil to pay.
yes, and I agree. So the original question you asked about, does Virginia have vouchers? We do not. And unfortunately, you all know Virginia's history. We are the second, Richmond was the second capital of the Confederacy, and Danville was the third. So we have this aversion to vouchers. However, our governor does not. And neither does he care, and neither do his folks care. However, in the league, we did, State League Virginia, we did a study in 2017, 2018 by Carol Nagel, and it was talking about vouchers. We have made it a point to remind people that vouchers resegregate schools. And so my phrase for that is, it creates an educational system that robs from the needy and gives to the greedy.
Good. Very good.
And so I've been testifying and so on in the past. But so this year, the Republicans didn't even bring it up. It was all about trying to get money for the rural areas because they don't have the tax base.
Yeah.
And
Denise,
that's exactly what's happening in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Is that the vouchers, not just the vouchers, but not supporting the public schools is resegregating the schools.
It is.
We've had studies, there's been studies done about that.
Yeah. Denise, I just don't want you to take too much of the blame for Virginia for the war. Remember, South Carolina started it.
Yes, but I'm afraid, remember Governor Stanley here, and he was almost as bad as Wallace about segregation. So remember, we started the idea of, hey, let's get all the Southern governors and just shut down the schools. Which is why even myself, born in 1962, I couldn't start public schools till going into my third year. And I was just lucky, though. My dad got the job in 1964 as band director and chair of the music department at Hampton University. And so in those days, and I hate to bring up this word, but I'm going to bring it up. I started out in I don't even know if I went to kindergarten, but first and second grade. No, yeah, K1 and 2. No. First and kindergarten is still not required in Virginia, but first and second grade, I went to Hampton University's laboratory school. And those days, laboratory schools were not vouchered or anything like what our governor thought he could pull, and everybody voted against it. It was really innovation and stuff, but controlled by the university. And so a lot of people just decided to do that out of their own pockets. And my parents did have to pay, but obviously with 6 children, it was a reduced rate. You're talking about maybe $200 the whole year back in the 60s. So, but third grade, I was able to safely attend. So I said that because that didn't work out so well for my older sisters and brother. Public schools in Hampton, Virginia. People came on and the TV and said, we're not going to take these children in our classroom. And if we do, we're not going to educate them. So almost every single Black church in downtown Hampton had a tutoring program that they still have today.
Mhm.
But things are very different today. But I just wanted to, you're absolutely right. Maybe not Virginia take the blame, but to me, Virginia.
But I do want to point out that after Brown versus Board of Education, it scared the heck out of the South Carolina legislature. So they instituted a sales tax to upgrade the Black schools in the hopes of preserving segregation.
Well, that happened in Prince Edward County
Yeah.
and Barbara Johns. They finally gave them this really nice schools, but it was too late.
Yeah.
It was too late. Oliver Hill, a local civil rights attorney and Thurgood Marshall, got to Barbara Johns and she said, "We just want a new school." And he said, "No, this is greater than that." And then they finally looked at the big picture, but that's what happened. You're absolutely right. They finally gave them, and we saw the picture was brick and nice, and
Yep. Yep.
But this is also complex. If you're not from the South, and there's so many of us moving to the South, it takes you 3 years to figure out what people are talking about in terms of how things are structured, what taxes are doing, what your tax dollars can't do,
Yep.
and how it's connected. So
Yep.
it's, in the meantime, everybody takes advantage of people not understanding that. So one of the best things I experienced was a local, university where it's like understand your county and understand your state. The more that, and I know our league has been doing some civic education, that we can grab people that are moving in, because if it takes us all 5 years to figure out what's going on, then it takes another 5 years to turn the boat around, so to speak. But it's hard to understand this if again, it's the same thing. It's outside your experience. You're like, what do you? It just was so foreign to me to understand how things happened here. And I talk to people all the time that say the same thing. So the league, I think, has done great work and needs to really focus on getting these seminars out to the general public, I guess, the churches. That seems to be the vehicle in North Carolina, at least.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Although I'd love to keep this discussion going for hours. It's for me particularly, I take a great interest in it. So I think, Elaine, if we could go to my last slide. And by the way, Denise, while we're waiting, you got a rob from the greedy to pay for the needy. We all need to hammer that message. She loved it.
Yes, that is good.
So good feedback on that. I wanted to share to you. I do want to thank our 3 guest speakers this evening. It was a great discussion, and it was very informative, as well as I know it'll be useful to our committee as we revise our North Carolina tax policy position statement. Before we end, I would like to go over a few items that you see on the slide. Recording of tonight's session with the slides will be posted to the LWVNC website. You can find it under the ACT or ACT menu, and then click on Lead Action Team, and then click on State and Local Tax Policy. We have also posted in the same location recordings of the prior 3 sessions and additional resource documents, including basic terminology and associated definitions used throughout the series, and a timeline of the major North Carolina tax law changes. We also recently have posted a page or 2 that was given to us by Jean McLaren, who was one of our panelists at our last session, that, and I'm paraphrasing here, I call it the corporate wish list of things that they look for when they're looking to either expand or move to another location. And interestingly, a trained or educated workforce is, if it's not at the top, it's in the top 3, and taxes are like number 10. So you may want to check that out as well. Our 5th and final session is going to be held on Thursday, June 6th, 7 p.m. via Zoom. And that's actually where we're going to come to member agreement on an updated LWVNC state and local tax policy position statement. This session will be facilitated by a league member. But further details of registration will come, including, obviously, we will circulate that revised statement statewide to members prior to the session. So I thank everyone for attending tonight. If you have any questions, please contact Ruth Ann or me. Our email addresses are also on the LWVNC website. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Enjoyed meeting all of you. Look forward to meeting some of you at convention in DC.